All right. For POIs, please stand up about vocalizing, and if I don't notice, please vocalize. And for my gender pronouns, please call me she or her. Hmm. All right, then. Starting my speech in three, two, one. We believe that taxation on retained earnings are necessary because otherwise company would have too much money left over the necessity. And I think this benefit workers who are unable to get higher salary even though company has so much reserves suffering under stagflation in the status quo. Happy to propose. Before moving on to my main arguments, I would like to set three pieces of framing. Firstly, why this motion even takes place in the first place? I think it's for governments to cope with inflation where people cannot buy daily necessities. That is why they want to get this retained earnings that company has as reserve to they use this as a tax get this from tax and pay that and get back to the people on the ground who is suffering people on the ground workers who are suffering under the status quo because the inflation is happening, they cannot buy anything. So state has enough incentive to circulate that to people on the ground with that taxation for it. And I think when they don't do that, I think in terms of voting incentive, they would get huge backlash from people because if that taxation goes to kind of like military things that is not related to people on the ground at all. So politicians do have this incentive, enough incentive to circulate that on people on the ground. Okay, secondly, how does taxation work? And I think this kind of taxation corresponds with how much reserve you have as a retained earnings. So as much as like the more you have retained earning, the more taxation works. Simply. Okay, thirdly, how does corporation cope with this kind of taxation? I think corporation is not that stupid. So they're likely to leave at least necessary amount of reserves to cope with the emerging situation. That is enough because they think, as logically prior, they would think that they need to sustain their life as a company. So in order for do that, always need to have this something to cope with the risk that they always have. Okay, then moving on to my main arguments. I have two arguments today. Firstly, talking about why company have too much money left over necessity. Then secondly, telling why it's better for people on the ground in our side of the house. Okay, then why company have too much money left over the necessity? And I think this is because to maximize their profit. Companies is likely to maximize the amount of reserves they have as a retained earning because they're profit seekers. The retained earning becomes and will be counted as the financial power of the company. The more reserve you have, the more power you can appeal to others as your asset, right? So the more reserve you have, that means you have more power to appeal to others. That's why as a profit seeker, they would maximize the amount of retained earnings. B, they can legitimate paying less to workers. They could justify that paying less to worker by saying, okay, this will be our reserve for emergency cases, etc. in our kind of cases. And then they don't want to spend that much on workers because if workers admit the lowest payment they suggest to workers, that means the company don't have to pay that much, which means that they can gain more, they can have more in their wallet, right? So that's why they're likely to legitimate paying less to workers by this retained earnings. They're simply scared. I think political situations and political affiliation right now is quite scary. It's fluctuating right now. China, Russia, Ukraine, or Iran or Israel. There are many countries going on conflict, and I think if you watch TV or if you watch economic newspaper, you would constantly see these kind of like threatening message that, oh, economy is inflating. Oh my gosh, stagflation is happening. And I think in these kind of cases, note that not only large company, but also SMEs, small and middle company will be also scared of paying more to investment or workers because single payment, they would think that, okay, this single payment could affect them in the worst case, right? So they would be extremely careful to increase the reserves they have in order for them to not be scared, in order for them to have as much comfort as possible in this kind of like fluctuating situation. So the impact here is that stagflation simply happens. And I think stagflation happens due to political affiliations and due to companies like usual move as a profit seekers. And I think this because company pool their money while not increasing the amount of payments to workers, but stagflation, it's so that the economy will be stagnant because companies not paying their money to the market. And I think in these kind of cases, the amount of like share would increase. But the thing is that this will not be used because workers are not getting enough money to pay for the inflation that is happening right now. So this is important because the rates of daily necessity would rise while workers do not have any increase in their income. So it's important that people cannot reach this daily necessity easily when they have no increase in income. For example, they can simply get enough meal to eat on daily basis, or they can't buy birthday present for their child. Workers would feel that they can feel no satisfaction and I think the only feeling that they would have is the urge to work more to at least get a little bit more salary, which doesn't make any sense, which doesn't make any delta because the inflation is happening at the rate that they cannot simply cope with by single person's effort. Then it's why it's better in our side of the house because company will invest more to their company rather than like meaninglessly remaining on their wallets. Right? A, higher payment to workers. Rather than paying tax for people unrelated to its company had the incentive to pay much more to workers because workers will stay longer. They would contribute more if you can have this higher payment. And I think now you cannot legitimate paying less to workers because workers will get mad if their reservation will be like taxed and paid to other kind of people who is unrelated to the company. So workers will definitely care about these kind of reserves, whether that reserves would be paid back to them. And I think this is a more proximate incentive that companies will follow in our counterfactual world. B, higher investment facility. In the status quo, you benefit is when you have reserve. And I think this is stable, this is no risk for a company. But in our counterfactual world, your benefit maximizes when you invest to your facility, right? So it will be you would always have this frequent update of AI or machines that you have, or check on working environment. You would try to build more like toilets or like facilities for working workers in your company. That because that would directly leads you to have this kind of stable and more profitability. And I think this would directly correlate and directly increases the benefit that you have compared to paying tax to any other person that is not related to company. So this is likely to happen. So the impact here is that simply A, workers can live better life because now with the inflation, although inflation is keep happening right now, they don't have to be like that desperate compared to opposition side to gain money because now company is paying the reserves that they have paying back to them. It was their benefit in the first place, right? Their benefit is just paying back to them, and I think they can be satisfied with that. They are getting them enough amount of legitimate amount of money that they should have got in the opposition paradigm, and I think this would lead them to have this enough money to pay for many daily necessities, enough money to pay for birthday present for your child. And I think workers can be more feeling satisfaction on their work. And I think you can have this more money flowing into the market, which means that as a large, in aspect of large amount of people, I think it's more likely that the stagflation is at least be better off in our counterfactual world. Proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that wonderful speech, calling upon leader of opposition to open the case side off.
Gender pronouns he or him, and he or I, please stand up. I'll start my speech. 3, 2, 1. Go. I'll start my speech. 3, 2, 1. So first, what will happen when this taxation is implemented? And second, impact. So first, what will happen when this taxation is implemented? The answer is very simple and intuitive. Capitals of company will decrease. For example, like in the world without the taxation status quo, companies can store money that remain after paying all expenses. Like for instance, like a company used to store 10 million yen per year by like by the which is consumed to be the retained earnings. However, after taxation is implemented, the company need to pay more than 20% of it, and the cost of it is pretty high, really, right? And easily suggest that this have tremendous influence to the company's financial situations. Next, impact. Three things to say. A. So when the company's capacity was reduced, what they can practically do is like really decrease, because like they need to cut the expenses for they cut the expenses used for the, like, for example, SEG investment, or like the money that is needed for the internship for the students, researches on the products, donation to the like developing countries, and at last scholarship program. So these the companies cannot cut fixed fees, right? So the fees that is likely to be cut by the taxation in this motion is like the things that I mentioned before, like these five things: SAG investment, internship, research, donation, scholarship. So the fixed fees are like the fixed fees that I mentioned before, like is the fundamental and essential for doing their own businesses. Like, for example, like even if you can lower the payment for the workers, you cannot make it zero, right? It's impossible. You need to keep paying at least the least money that is not supposed to be against common sense, right? And also, almost all companies are renting money from the banks or other companies in order to continue their business, make their business successful. So they need to return it. They need to return the money they rent in order to avoid bankrupting, right? So these kind of money is defined as fixed fees, and this is the money that the companies cannot cut even after the taxation. So, however, like the things that I mentioned, like investment or the internship and research donation, scholarship, are also very important and very influential to the society as well. So cutting these expenses is really problematic. Okay.
The problem with your case is that this tax is not from the place that you pay in the status quo, but it comes from a place that you do not use as a money in the status quo because it's a retained asset. Why does your case function?
My partner will answer it. And B, the company will be more volatile to the economical shock. Yeah, when the economical shock occurred, two things will be likely to happen. One, you need to keep the maintenance, what you need to do when the economical shock. One, you need to keep the maintenance fee to survive until the companies come back to the previous financial situation. This is very important because otherwise you cannot survive. You can go bankrupt, right? And second, you need to mitigate the damages you suffered from the, economical shock. What is needed to mitigate it is mitigate is only money, right? So for example, like this example is can be used for both two things. Like for example, like when Higashi Nihon Daishinsai was occurred, like Tokyo Denryoku had a had tremendous economical shock, right? They cannot they was forced to stop all the attack how can I say, nuclear plants. They are forced to stop all the nuclear plants in Japan. So they need to survive those times by like using these retained assets and doing other like ways of generating energies, right? So what I want to say here is that reserved assets is really important for the companies to survive, and being volatile to economical shock is really has a big impact. It's so problematic because like roughly divided into three things. One, when the like workers lose the job, their lives will be lost. They cannot lead their lives. And two, when the companies go bankrupt, citizens cannot access to the products they made. For example, like pharmaceutical companies go bankrupt. If the company bankrupt, citizens cannot use their medicals. And also third, a stakeholder will be damaged as well. Proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that wonderful speech. Now calling upon Deputy Chair Minister to communicate the slides on your care.
There's a significant amount of money that we gain on our side and it's going to be used on our side. The first thing I'm going to explain is why this money is likely to be used in a good way. The first layer to this is in terms of the retained earnings. So my first speaker already explained how the businesses have increased incentive to use these retained earnings for things like paying salary or things like research and development, insofar as they don't want like this to be taken away like by the government. I'm going to explain where the unique delta lies with the nuance that this uniquely only happens on our side. There are three things here. First of all, note that there's an incentive to benefit their company rather than have this money being taken away by the government and used on something that you don't have any control over. And therefore, we think that this is a new incentive that uniquely happens on our side. They're likely to use this to benefit their company in forms of salaries, etc. But second of all, note that right now, there's a status quo bias. There tends to be an old people in executives that say that historically we have this amount of retained earnings, and they want to like edge on the safe side, for example, and therefore it's very difficult to go against that and say, oh, we should cut down on this like retained earning in order to like use it for other things. We think that when this taxation happens, this becomes a unique tipping point for people, like other people in the executive to say and push back, to say that it's rather beneficial to use these retained earnings for like other things. And therefore, we think that that's the unique tipping point. But third mechanism is note that this becomes a chance for businesses to actually reassess their payment. Like and therefore they're going to think maybe we should give like more salaries to like the employees in order to have like high skilled labor like within their company and like motivate them. For example, we think that like when they start doing this, we think that that's going to be a good cycle for them to continue doing this. And therefore we think that that beneficial use of retained earning is likely and something that is unique on our side. Second layer in terms of the money that is being used, because there's also money that comes from that taxation that the government is going to have. We explain that how the tax allocation is likely to be used in order to control stagflation, which means it's probably going to be distributed to people on the ground. This might look like temporary like amount of money that is is distributed to anyone, or like subsidization of like daily goods, for example, rice, etc. Why this is likely is, first of all, the purpose of taxation of this retained earning, the way that it's likely to be justified by the politicians is to say that right now stagflation is happening, and therefore there's a necessity to do this, because they can't just say we're taxing corporations for no reason. We think that that leads to massive backlash from corporations, from consumers, etc. And therefore we think that there's likely to be large like checks and balances there to make sure that they're using it like for the right thing. But second of all, there's simply like tax allocation to people on the ground is something that is politically popular. You can see the effects very fast, because when you subsidize rice, people get the impression that maybe the economy is slightly better, that the daily necessities are slightly like cheaper when this person like was in office. And therefore we think it's something that like the government is likely to do. And therefore all of these mechanisms goes to prove that the people on the ground are likely to benefit from this. Next thing I'm going to do is on the weighing, because they say that there's likely to be economic shocks, and that the companies are unlikely to be able to go against like these shocks. So why using this earning now is much more important than like keeping it just in case a shock happens. First of all, first point of weighing is in terms of certainty. On our side, this money, there's a certain benefit that trickles down in terms of the salary to people on the ground, because you can use that to pay for your like increased expenses of food prices, etc. We think that there's just a certain benefit that happens when this money is used now. On the other hand, it's unlikely that shocks are going to happen to the level of bankruptcy, because A, you still have like company assets that are like expenses that you can cut down on like when such shocks happen. For example, you can temporarily like halt certain facilities or operations, etc. It's very unclear why you need this cash just in case when to sit around and do nothing when you can use like other things or cut down on other things when shocks happen. But B, we think when there's widespread economic shock, there are likely to be systems to like help these corporations out. This looks like governments like bailing out the large companies to prevent it from bankruptcy. And therefore, we don't think that that cash is necessary. They talked about the like shock of like Tokyo Denryuku. We think that in such like massive shocks, the cash that you had is going to be used up anyway. They're going to have to halt operations anyway. It's very unclear what the marginal benefit they earn of like prolonging that operation for a few more like days, for more months is going to achieve. But on our side, you're certain that that benefit of people being able to like buy goods better is going to happen. Second point of weighing is in terms of company obligation. We think that they have an obligation to use this for the people now, because the reason that you have the earnings, you're able to do the operation is simply because of the current employees or current consumers. We think that they deserve the valid compensation much more than the people that might like be hurt by this economic shock in the future. But we don't know even if this shock is going to happen. We think that it's we think that you should prioritize the people that are going to earn a certain benefit on our side. Finally, is in terms of impacting of stagflation. I'm going to explain like why the stagflation is terrible. On the individual level, it means you can't buy like daily necessities, that the price of the rice is very high. So you have to lower your consumption, or you might have to mix your rice like with wheat, etc. This looks like your children asking you why they can't eat more even though they're more hungry. This looks like you can't go out to eat like when you're tired of cooking, etc. But this also means that many opportunities are stripped away from families. You can't pay for the tuition of your children's cram school, or you can't afford them to go to university in an urban area because that means they have to live alone and your expenses increases, etc. And the important part of this is this stagflation worsens over time. Like if you don't have enough money and the price just keeps getting like higher, we think individuals have an incentive to like spend less. You save up like just in case you like things get like much more expensive. We think that this means that even less money is going to be circulating like in the economy. And therefore we think we also claim kind of the impact on the individual level when that money is being like used and they're able to use that to pay like expenses, but also on kind of the macro social level that we're tackling this stagflation in some way. Like when this money is not just sitting around like on corporation businesses and doing nothing, that it's injected in the economy in some way. So even if you're unsure like how this money is being used, at least it's circulating like within the economy that is likely to kind of get the benefit of like stopping or halting the stagflation so that prices don't rise too much and people are able to pay for their food. And therefore proud to propose.
Right, thank you for that great speech. Now on the contact leader of opposition to AFK side up. Here.
Firstly, proving why this taxation is significant for the corporation, especially talking about its reduced the capacity of a corporation. First reason why it is, if it's taxation, they have to pay taxes. It obviously reduces the capital they have. Even if it's a small percent, it is significant in absolute amount in the very first place, especially talking about if it's talking about the large company, it's also like pressurize and oppress the capacity that they have. The second thing is that it reduce the trust from investor. If they have a smaller retained earning, investor worry about if this company is all right. For example, if there is economic shock, for example, if there is strong competitor appears, investors feel worried about how this company can go well. And so I think that there is going to be less willingness for the people to invest in the company, especially talking about its impact for the SMEs that have, SMEs that have the most affected by the, which is likely to be affected by reducing the amount of capital they have. Then, having said that, I just want to explain why this taxation likely to host the company in worse way, and why cooperation is better acting than government in its impact. The first thing that I want to prove is about the philanthropy or research that corporation do. This looks like ESG investment or donation or scholarship program, or for example, further technological research or stuff like that. I think these are the things that company are already doing, especially considering that current global sentiment are talking about how they're likely to go in the green technology, or how they can cater to the people in developing country or stuff like that. I think this is a likely scenario that we want to posit. Then I think a company, in also a paradigm, the company is better actor, especially talking about how they are able to cater to the wider than compared to the government. For example, if they're considering that there is many private corporation, I think that there is some help the Southeast Asia, some helps Northeast Asia, some help Africa, stuff like that. I think the lines that they can approach is wider. Also, like they are able to make several scholarship programs. For example, one is for studying abroad, one is for a student going master's or doctor's degree, some is for the helping per household, stuff like that. I think these scenarios are only available in our paradigm because I think in the comparative, the government has less capacity to do so. The first reason why is the country have one entity. Obviously, there are limited amount of they can do. Obviously, they also have to care about the reaction of the general public. So if it probably, less popular to, helping the developing country if it's not your country. I think this is something that's something that government have to care about. So I think these unique support are only available in our paradigm. The second reason why is I think that this support is likely to be more direct compared to the government, because like the taxes is the thing that, they pay the taxes and they have to reallocate the amount of taxes. In that instances, in the government side wanted to talk about this is used in a good way. Probably it's, the total all amounts of the money that they get from this taxation are not direct, solely direct to the like welfare system or stuff like that. In that instances, I think the support that the corporation can give is more direct, more supportful. I think this is the thing that we want to prove. And I think that when government side agree that this welfare system is important, we're able to provide that these gonna be the more wider lens, more likely to be used in a more manner. I think we have to prioritize our argument. And we want to note that this kind of like philanthropy or research is something that it is likely to be cut in their paradigm, because there is a fixed cost in the very first place. We have to pay for the people, maintain equipment. In that instances, I think this kind of like philanthropy is the one that is likely to be reduced. So I think that these kind of like even small reduce is likely to be significant, because one person cannot go to the university. This is significant impact. This is obviously significant impact. People cannot access to the clean water, for 1 year, stuff like that. I think this is significant impact. We have to prioritize in this debate. The second thing I want to say is that reaction to the economical shock. I think it is important because retaining earning is crucial to be resilient for shock. It is having enough retained earning having enough retained earning can absorb the shock they received. For example, if you get $100 loss, it is less affected. You have $1,000 than $500. I think this is very intuitive. But if you cannot generate the profit in economical recession, you have to reserve money for maintain compression within that economical recession. For example, you have to still pay for the workers, you still pay for the maintain the system. I think these kind of things that's why I think the retained earning is pretty much important in our paradigm. This is hugely important because even if small chances, I think we have to weigh up this argument. Even if it's small chances, it still affected the people to significant degree. For example, people lay off, they cannot sustain their life. Probably it's cost cuts. Also, like it is also affect when in the worst cases the company is bankrupt. I think this is significant impact, but I think that this is quite likely, especially talking about small to medium corporation. And I think that this SMEs providing the necessary product and necessary support for the company, society. For example, not only people employed, but also detrimental to society. If medical equipment was not supplied or delayed, hospital cannot deal with the emergent patient. I think this is a significant impact happening that we cannot ignore. In that instances, I think it is significantly important to see that being resilient to the economic shock is very much important. Comparative is that they talk about people we can bail out. Firstly, I think the decision-making process is likely to be slow, that people have to suffer in that time. But secondly, I think government have to select who to save in the very first place, because especially talking about economical shock, probably government have to pay several subsidies for several company. In that instances, I think it's difficult to determine which company to provide subsidy, how amounts of money you provide, stuff like that. In that instances, I think bailout is not that effective. It is much better to sustain by themselves. At least I think that bailouts cost a significant amount of money. I don't think that they are able to claim that it's better to have just bailout. The third thing I want to say is that the cost cut happen in a worse way. For example, they reduce the payment for workers. I think they talk about the rationalization of how you legitimize reducing taxes, reducing your worker payment. I think in our paradigm we can also legitimize. Well, for example, since we have the less retained earning now, and it's important to secure retaining earnings, so please endure lowering the prices or lowering wages. I think this is a scenario that are likely to happen as a rationalization. Then I think this is more likely to happen than what government side talking about corporation give higher salary to avoid taxation. Why is the case? The payment corporation have to make one change in either side. There is a fixed cost. We have to maintain research equipment or rent fee, stuff like that. In that instance, the corporation know how important to secure retained earning is necessary. And I think the way that people circular economy is not necessarily give back to the company. I think in that sort of paradigm, company only have to pay taxes. It is different in amount compared to the government side, but I think at least secure the more retained earning, which is significant benefit for the corporation. We already told you. In that instances, I think this is the most certain certain impact that happening to the corporation. So I think this company are likely to cause in the reducing these kind of things rather than reducing the retaining earning. Yeah, oppose.
All right, thank you for that great speech. Comment upon government with to indicate your side here.
First, about what companies are likely to do on either side, but second, about the economical shock. First, about what companies are going to do on either side of the house. The problem in the opposition case is that I pointed out my POI, but the problem is that the place where you take the tax is where the money is not used in the first place in the status quo. If you have 1 million yen not used in the status quo, the government are going to additionally tax the 1 million yen which is not used. So their claim on how there's an decrease of investment is absurd, because obviously they are not using it in a status quo. Why would it decrease if you tax it a company? company. I think this is obviously absurd. But rather, on our side of the house, you increase the amount of investment or scholarship, because now if you reserve the amount of the money, you're going to be stripped of that money you generate from the company. That is the reason why it creates a unique incentive for corporation to actually donate more or invest more in a much more diverse manner on our side of the house. Because now if you do not use the money, your money is going to go to the government's pocket, which does not directly necessarily benefit the corporation in the first place. This is problematic because this flips opposition case. If Op wants to diversify the ways in which you guys invest or donate to other countries, obviously it's better on our side because you can diversify the targets of the investment, because these corporations do not want to get taxed in the first place. Then the incentive claim from opposition is that investors or shareholders of corporation would rather welcome corporation using that money rather than making this an asset. This is a unique point that Prime Minister already pushed. Now the investor wants a corporation that has loads of reserves because it looks stable. But now, if you're going to be taxed that annually, now you're going to look much more volatile to shocks, because now you're going to be taxed every annual year if you make the reserve to a larger amount. But now the investors like to shift this incentive to feel that now what company is much more lucrative is a company which has less reserves, because now that means that you simply do not let this money go to the government's pockets. Now you seem that you're much more you have much more chances to use that money for your corporation. That means there's going to be more investor confidence on the our side when you can utilize that money for your corporation, not making a reserve in the first place. That is the reason why this is important, because notice that on our side of the house, you actually garner or co-opt the impact from opposition, explaining how there's more likelihood of much more diversified portfolios or much more diversified investments on the our side of the house. But second, about the economical shock. Obviously, we are telling you from the head of our speech that we are not so stupid. The corporations are not so stupid to give out all of these reserves in the first place. It's not a 0 or 100 game. We can make it a much more multitude of spectrum on the outside of the house. We are totally fine with the decreased amount of reserves, because first, we already explained to you why there's an excessive amount of resilience or excessive amount of reserves in the first place. Because these corporations are overestimating the harms likely to happen in the future. We are totally fine with decreasing the amount, which is over the necessity. But second, even if you consider the fact that maybe it's somewhat less resilient on the our side, we're not saying that these corporations are going to collapse so easily, right? Because notice that it's not a 0 resilience on the our side of the house. But second, obviously, often alternative exists when this shock happens. For example, cutting costs within your corporation. For example, using less electricity or using less factory to function, or decreasing the amount of expenditures other than the salary, etc. But second, using the example of Toden was funded by the government, because the failure of Toden means that this country will die out. This is the reason why there's tons of alternatives on the outside of the house other than reserves as well. But last of all, if you want to talk about the workers, these workers are going to be paid well even if they lose jobs or lose jobs in recession. There isn't enough incentive for the state to garner support, and therefore they are likely to support these people even if this company fucks up. What is rather bad is that now you simply have less salary, which is simply these people are facing a problem in the status quo. But notice, the states or the government cannot do anything, because even if the vegetables prices or the rice prices increases, the amount of people are suffering is large. Almost all the citizens are suffering. Almost all the people in the world are suffering. That is the reason why you cannot help under status quo. This can be uniquely solved when this resilience or this retained assets are likely to decrease on the our side, because it now increases the wages of these people on the ground. This is obviously much more important. Last of all, the weighing. First, likelihood weighing. Notice that the problem we identify on our side of the house, such as stagflation, which prevents people from buying daily necessities or buying goods in a sufficient prices, is already happening. Companies are ignoring this, saying that, I have to protect my company, I have to protect you, I'm totally fine with making these reserves happening. This is obviously something that is absurd. You obviously have to protect the workers who is suffering in a status quo compared to future potential harm that you don't know whether this happens in decades or centuries, right? You do not know whether your corporations are going to fuck up in 10 or 100 years. But notice, the worker in front of you are suffering in a status quo. Obviously, you should not ignore these people on the ground. I don't think they provide any likelihood analysis. The naive push from them is that even if the likelihood is low, it's better to protect these people because this is important. First of all, the solvency towards this problem is unclear on their side of the house, because unclear as in how this reserve actually helps the people on the opposition. In the worst case, where opposition impact lies, you cannot solve these people. If that is a massive recession, if that's a massive problem that opposition painted, I do not necessarily see why these reserves are likely to help these people, because they use the example of Toden, right? I think Toden had a bunch of amount of reserves, but they had to lay off many workers. They had to lay off many factory workers because their wages or because their summary did not go to Kuroji, right? This is obviously bad. This is likely to happen under symmetrical on either side of the house. Before moving on to my weighing on why our side is better, yes.
I think that there is no narrative coming from Komitara to explain why this taxation uniquely makes the meaningful differences. I think that you have tiny delta.
No. You increase the wages. That solves the inflation because now you simply have much more money in the pocket, which means that you can afford much more goods. We're not saying that we can solve inflation. This is obviously not true. But we are saying that we have much more money in the pocket, which means that you simply have much more consumer power to buy things which is lined up in the stores. This is obviously true, right? Then, rather on our case, also engages or flips worst case scenario on opposition by making it uniquely possible for individual workers to earn more money and increase the bank deposit of individuals. This way is important. This way of tackling recession or shock is much better because one, it can tackle much wider range of problems or shocks because the problem that opposition can solve is maybe the worst case scenario shock that this corporation use money for. But on the other side, we can provide a spectrum of shocks. For example, the increase of rice prices or the increase of vegetable prices cannot be solved even if this corporation have a reservation because they do not give out money for corporate workers if that shock is subtle, right? But on the other side, you simply have much more money in your pocket for all the workers on the ground, which means that you simply have much more resilience to wider range or wider scope of problems on the other side of the house. But second, you don't know whether you will be laid off in a time of crisis. The premise on opposition is that all the workers are going to be still laid within their side of the house in order for this case to fly because companies do not provide money for people who are laid off, right? On the other side of the house, the fact that you simply have much more money in your pocket before the recession means that you simply have much more resilience as an individual towards a problem that might happen in the future. For example, if the COVID-19 strikes Japan, and if you were not in the status where you do not have any money in the deposit or banks, this is problematic. But on the other side, the fact that you simply increase the amount of money in your bank, in your pocket, means that you're resilient to this problem, no matter whether you're laid or not, or whether you're hired or not. This is important because under opposition, they do not prove that they are totally like hired, right? On the other side, you prove you have much certain impact, certain weighing proposed.
Now on opposition with here.
Okay. Three things coming from me. So firstly, how companies react to additional taxation. Secondly, how we save average or more vulnerable workers better in inflations and stagflations. And lastly, why even if you do not take this claim, companies are simply a better actor to invest and use money. Firstly, on how companies are going to react to additional taxation. GOP says companies keep too much reserves, and if we tax them, they will start using monies to avoid tax. Two responses to this. So firstly, obviously, they have an incentive to use this. The only mechanism the government told us to say, they don't use money right now is the school bias. I don't think companies are the one that relies on tradition so much because they are the most profit-seeking ones. Obviously, profit-seeking incentive is more important than sales school bias because obviously it leads to much more profit. And I think that because there is severe international competition, that is a reason to add on why they need to get rid of these traditions and try to use money more. And therefore, I think that their claim about how there's too much reserves are simply unrealistic. Secondly, they told us how more using reserves more is good, but I also point out two things here. So firstly, I think that they simply lack comparative. They told us, companies want more reserves. They never explained why this changes because obviously when taxation is still proportionate, even in their side, if you have more net amount of reserves, even if you are taxed, at least you have more reserves that is remaining, which means if companies are so risk averse, they're going to try to maximize the amount of reserves they have in both paradigm, and that's why the money they use is going to simply not going to decrease, and obviously they never proved why in the comparative it leads to spending that much. So I think that their comparative is largely unproved. And secondly, they miss our nuance. That our nuance is not that reserve is something that company directly use to investment. We told you how reserve is important to increase the company's ability to avoid risk and risk hedge, and therefore when they have this enough ability to risk hedge, they have more incentive to use money and increase spending. I mean, spending is risky because you never know if it's going to come back or not, and that's why if you have more money that is secured and you know that even if you go bankrupt, you can use this money to bail yourself out, and that is why company get more
amount of spending. So I don't think that they are largely engaged in our case properly. And obviously in their side, because companies want to avoid more risk, they're going to do things like, laying off ESG, or these things are going to be decreasing. And also there's going to be less investment to like, niche project that, benefits minority people, etc., etc. And therefore it's simply harm. And then the impact remains on them is about, stagflations and stuff. And then let's talk about how like we save average workers better in these kinds of situations. So they talk about how like they can save like, people because government can, give money to the people, but they never proved why, government can actually help, all the people in the nation as a single entity. Obviously, government has a lot of different things to invest into. They have to invest in, like, for example, military, etc., etc. And therefore, it's quite unlikely that in their side, people can actually be bailed out or like be supported in a significant way. So their impact is unproved in the very first place. And what we proved is that in our side, we can at least save the people who are working in the company. For example, the people who are simply, working in a company and like receive like salary from the companies and stuff. And then what they say is the companies can, give money to these people. Because they're going to release money. Even if the companies release money because of the taxation, I don't think that this impacts people in crisis so much, because obviously that when you release the money, it's not in the timing of stagflation, and therefore people are not going to keep that money because the economy is running good. They're going to spend that money to elsewhere, which means that in case of stagflation, when that actually happens, people don't have that money to save them and bail them out, right? That's why even if companies do release money at some stage, it's better if they keep the money until some sort of crisis happen and then release it so that people can actually use it to save themselves out. So then weighing again, why workers of companies should be prioritized than the people that we protect on their side. I think even if we take their best case, you are able to prove to you that we save the people in the company better, because obviously it's more direct. Company give them more salary, they have more money to pay their necessity and stuff, and they only in their best case, they only provide support to people like who are the most poor, or for example the people who has no job, all these kind of things. But we think that simply workers in the companies are more important and should be prioritized because they have no alternative sources of support. Because the really, really poor people have things like, welfare that they can get support from the government. And I think that these people, the average workers, middle class workers, are still vulnerable because, for example, they are living paycheck by paycheck. They have no savings, which means that in case of stagflation, inflation and stuff, they have not enough money to, they simply they have to cut living costs, and therefore decreasing salary is quite crucial for them. And secondly, oftentimes there are the people that government don't support, and welfare is least likely to reach these people because obviously the government capacity to give welfare is limited, and when they have to bail out a lot of people for their whole lives, whole living, in case of, for example, in stagflations and stuff, therefore they don't have the capacity to actually help these people. Corporations are the unique actor that can help these people, and we think that these people are the most vulnerable because they have no alternative, and also these are the vast majority of people, and therefore which puts us above the more vulnerability metric. Note that this also engages with their main case about stagflation, because the target of their things like welfare necessity that governments do is only the most poor people. The thing is, these people's spending does not change significantly because they only spend the necessary cost. Even in stagflation, they have to eat, they cannot starve. So even if we give somewhat more money to them, their spending is not going to increase significantly. That's why it's quite unlikely that these people try to solve stagflation. Comparatively, the people who we support, the middle class workers, are the most likely character that solve this because their spending are most likely to increase significantly. But okay.
To what extent can your reserve money or retained asset can save these people in economic recessions?
Simply, I think that this amount of or extent is the same because obviously your money, our money and company go to your government, but we save people more better because obviously if it's the same amount of money, we save people directly and we save the people with no alternative, so it's better. Okay, moving on. Comparatively, the people who we save is more capable of stopping stagflation because they are the people who change their daily expenses most significantly, the people who limit the times they eat out, so the people who limit the times go on vacation and stuff, and these people are massive in number, meaning that we cope with stagflation better. And they can't say companies can give money because, as I said, the timing is quite different. We win in metric of first vulnerability, we protect the more vulnerable people, and secondly, the timing is better
better in order to save people, and therefore in terms of economic crisis, we win. Lastly, even if you take none of this, we think that simply companies' investment is good. So firstly, because of their good incentive, they have more long-term goals, and also they have like incentive to cater to diversified incentive, and therefore they cater to more number of people. And secondly, simply corporation can uniquely increase the net amount of money they have through like things like investment. If they have more reserve, they do like more investment, which means that the net amount of money increases on our side. But governments do not do that because welfare and these things are quite limited. They do not come back, which means that even if you take none of this, simply we get more money, we save more people. That's why simply corporations having these money are far better than governments having those.
Right, thank you for that great speech. Now calling upon leader of opposition to reply to end the case for side opposition. You're here.
Firstly, talking about which side are able to save the people on the ground. Government side talking about, government analysis is very one-liner because all mechanization, all impact relies on them proving like individual work will get highest money. But I don't think they are able to prove it because I think firstly, it is not true. We already told you how government are not used, how this corporation are unlikely to use money to, for increase of the payment in order to avoid the taxation. First reason why is simply this corporation acknowledge how important it is. The second reason why is cost benefit calculus of a corporation. Even if they pay money to the people, does not mean that, benefit the corporation, obviously. They have to pay taxes anyway for retained earning that they, considering at least they secure a necessary amount. In that instances, they have to pay for, I think the amount of like expenditure a corporation have to pay is not that big differences. They have to pay solely for the people plus taxation, and we pay the taxation. I think that there is no like weighing us. I don't think there is something the big differences between that. In that instance, the corporation likely to choose to secure as much money as possible in retained earning because this is more directly benefit corporation. It is unclear in their salary paradigm if these giving the highest salary for the worker benefit this corporation. But I think in our salary paradigm, reserving the money is something that directly benefit corporation. So I don't think this is likely to happen. That thing that company give money to workers and unlikely to happen in their salary paradigm. The second reason why is that even if it's true, they cannot say increase in the wages means that the individual will be resilient to the inflation or stuff like that because there are many workers in the company. Probably the increase of the payment for each individual is small. It was unclear for them as to explain why this make the meaningful differences in the reaction towards the inflation. I think we want to weigh up our argument because I think this what we proved is more direct support for the company. This is the more direct support the company offering. For example, like less lay off for the people, or probably support, giving the scholarship for the people, which open up the opportunity for people. But probably it's because probably it is donation for the people who can access to the food, who can access to the clean water, stuff like that. I think these are the direct benefit that corporation can offer compared to the opposition side talking about the very, very unclear benefits that unclear in the extent. We already suggested how important our impact is. In that instance, we also thought like more money are likely to direct it to this, philanthropy or resources compared to them because you don't have to take the process of reallocating the taxes. I think that they weren't able to, deal with the claim that, probably even if it's partly used to the good ways, it doesn't mean that the entire money will be used to in that philanthropy. I think that we are able to offer more money more money that will be directed to the people on the ground or people who are suffering. That's why we are already taking in this debate. The second thing I want to note here is that even if they take any impact coming from government side that they are able to offer the welfare, individual likely to be better off, we want to highlight how important to be resilient to the economical shock is. We've tried to argue like, we can capacitate the individual that is good. Obviously, I think the degree of impact is very different between the how company resilient and how individual resilient. I think we say that the company being resilient is far more important compared to individual being resilient. First reason why is the degree of impact is very different, because for example, if company are resilient, then individual might be less paid less. I mean, less paid less, or like less likely to be laid off. But in their side paradigm, if they laid off, they're more likely to be like laid off rather than the cutting cost, or degree of the cutting cost are likely to be huge in their side paradigm, which directly affect the individual. Obviously, it's better to have the job than nothing in their side paradigm. The second thing is the state doesn't have infinite capacity. I think they said like they can bail out, they can support people, but I don't think it was quite unclear why state have that much of incentive. They cannot save all people, but we also think that they cannot deal with the subsequent impact that are happening from economical shock. For example, hospital cannot get necessary medicine because the small corporation bankrupt, stuff like that. I think these worst case scenario cannot be dealt by their side paradigm, which I think we have to consider in this debate, which is have the huge impact proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that great speech. Now we'll move on to reply to Gates rebut and the debate as a whole here.
I just want to start with clarifying the comparative. It's not necessarily about should we take more money away from corporations, because this is not a debate about increasing corporate taxes. We are taxing something very specific, which are the cash reserves, which are the illiquid assets after all the expenses of the companies has been sent. So if companies don't want to pay more taxes, what we say is they can increase their expenses, which looks like giving out more salaries, which looks like increasing production, new facilities, or the donation that opposition wants to claim. So our argument is that it is better for corporations to use these money instead of having it as cash that is simply sitting there. So I don't think that you can take the claim from their side that it is better for corporations to use these reserves, because there's no analysis on why these cash reserves, when not being taxed on their side, is going to be used on their side. It literally goes against the definition of retained earnings. If it is being used as an expense, it's probably not a reserve in the first place. We give you multiple analysis of why it is likely to be cash that is just sitting there. For example, one, we explain that companies are overly cautious about shocks and therefore are likely to have these like reserve in there, but also the fact that there's status quo bias, which makes it hard to decrease these retained earnings in the first place. But second, we explain that it's a way to show stability. The way to show stability in terms of investment is to have a lot of reserves. Taisuke already explained how this calculus changes after that taxation, and that decreased reserves is going to be seen as more stable, etc. What they say is that there's a profit incentive anyway, and they're going to use these retaining earnings even without this taxation. If that is the case, we think that that also kills their argument. They just decrease the delta that doesn't benefit their side. Then talking about the resilience to shocks, several things. First of all, they give no likelihood analysis of any economic shocks happening. We explain that often companies are just overly cautious. They're less likely to need to use these cash reserves in the first place. We also mitigate the extent of their impact because we explain even without these cash reserves, you can cut down on the expenses that you are currently using at that point, like when the economic shock happens, rather than have that cash sit around and you don't even know if you're going to use it or not. But second issue is like they don't really explain like why, if there were to be these massive shocks, having this like some amount of cash is going to surely save the company or surely save the employee. We think at best it's largely speculative. It's a benefit that you probably shouldn't credit. But third of all, they say they send out like money to individuals in these like economic shocks. Probably not. We think that they're trying to save the company in and of itself. So I don't think that's a benefit that they claim. But fourth of all, I think it's just an unfair comparative. We're not saying that the reserves are zero on our side, that the company is going to like just use it all and like have nothing in cases of shocks. So they're just left to die. We already gave you the incentive analysis, capacity analysis of these corporations of actually assessing where these money like should be used additionally. And that calculus uniquely happens on our side when they're forced to think about cutting down on these retained expenses in order to avoid these taxation. What we say is our impact is simply just more certain and more important. We explain that these corporations are forced to use these money like on their company. So this might look like just research and development, more innovation that allows the company to maybe earn more profit. And we also explain it's likely to trickle down to the employees in terms of like increase in salary, which is especially important in these era where there's a lot of inflation and it's very hard for people to pay for food or like pay for their children's education. We think that more amount of people are just certainly much more happier on our side. They don't explain the likelihood of these like shocks happening or like these people being saved on their side. And therefore, we think that you simply should credit our side. But additional benefit is the fact that the government can use these taxation money to also give this like to the people. And therefore, the comparison isn't between, is it better for government to use it or corporations to use it? We claim that we just use it both on our side. It's unclear how they have a benefit on their side and therefore proud to propose.